My name is Charlotte Halloway, and I am 32 years old. For most of my life, I was known simply as the vicar's daughter, a quiet, bookish girl living in the shadow of the grand Blackwood Manor and its glittering heiress. I never imagined that the one thing everyone dismissed as my most useless eccentricity would become the key that could lock or unlock a fortune, the weapon in a battle I never intended to fight, and the source of the sweetest, most unexpected revenge. Before I dive into how a few dusty Italian documents changed everything, I want to say hello to everyone watching. Let me know where you're from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt overlooked or had your passions dismissed by someone you cared about, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the new viewers, subscribing to the channel means you'll be joining a community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell. The world I grew up in was a study in contrasts, a perfect miniature of the old English class system contained within the boundaries of a single, sleepy village. There was Blackwood Manor, a sprawling stone beast of a house that commanded the highest hill, its windows like 100 eyes gazing down with imperious ownership upon the rolling green fields and the cluster of cottages below. And then there was our home, the vicarage, a modest but sturdy house of gray stone and ivy, nestled beside the ancient parish church with its stooping yew trees. The vicarage was filled with the scent of old books, beeswax, and my mother's baking, a scent of gentle, scholarly poverty. My father, the Reverend Michael Halloway, was a man whose quiet faith was matched only by his fierce love for literature. He was a good man, a kind man, but the stipend for a rural vicar was barely enough to keep us clothed and fed, a fact that was never allowed to be forgotten in the presence of the manor's occupants. And at the heart of the manor, the very sun around which our small village world revolved, was Isabel Blackwood. We were the same age, born in the same month, a fact she often cited as a sort of cosmic joke. She was the sole heir to the Blackwood fortune, a sprawling inheritance of land, investments, and properties that was spoken of in hushed, awed tones. I was the vicar's daughter, the recipient of her outgrown clothes, and the beneficiary of her family's charity, a word she wielded with the casual cruelty of a surgeon's scalpel. Our friendship, if it could be called that, was a thing of unspoken rules and rigid hierarchies. I was the quiet, clever satellite to her dazzling, demanding star. I was useful for helping with her schoolwork, for listening to her endless complaints, for being a constant, reassuring reminder of just how fortunate she was. The dynamic was established early. I remember my 8th birthday. My father, knowing we couldn't afford the pony I desperately dreamed of, had spent months painstakingly restoring a set of second-hand children's classics for me. The leather was rubbed soft with oil, the gold lettering on the spines polished until it gleamed faintly. He presented them to me with a flourish, his eyes shining with pride. "Books, Charlotte," he'd said, his voice a low, warm rumble, "are magic carpets. They can take you anywhere in the world, to any time in history, without ever leaving this room." I had clutched them to my chest, the smell of old paper and glue filling my senses, a treasure beyond measure. Later that day, Isabella had trotted up to the vicarage on her new birthday present, a snow-white pony with a braided mane and a saddle of soft new leather. She'd looked down at me from her lofty perch, her nose wrinkled in disdain as she eyed the books in my arms. "Still playing with dusty old stories?" she'd chirped, her voice carrying the clear, ringing tone of someone who had never been told no. "Daddy says books are for people who can't afford real adventures." She'd then galloped away across the lawn, leaving me standing there, the weight of her words pressing down on me more heavily than the books I held. The magic carpets felt a little less magical after that. This pattern repeated itself through our teenage years. At the annual village garden party, a major social event orchestrated by her mother, Lady Blackwood, I wore a dress that my own mother had spent weeks altering. It was a hand-me-down from a cousin, a pale blue cotton that was perfectly respectable, but it was, undeniably, not new. Isabella, draped in a confection of silk and lace, that must have cost more than my father's monthly salary, made a great show of rushing over to me in front of a group of her friends from boarding school. She'd fussed with my collar, her fingers cool and condescending. "Oh, Charlotte, darling, you must let me lend you something next time," she'd said, her voice dripping with pity that was meant to be heard by everyone. "We can't have you looking like a poor little church mouse, can we? I'm only trying to help." The laughter from her friends was a wave of heat on my face. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me, but I just stood there, murmured my thanks, and endured it. That was my role, to endure. My only true escape, my personal Narnia, was my father's study. It was a room where the walls were lined floor to ceiling with books. A beautiful, chaotic jumble of theology, history, poetry, and fiction. It was in that room that my father gave me the gift that would, years later, change the course of my life. He had a passion for Italian, born from a youthful trip to Florence, where he had fallen in love with the language of Dante Alighieri. He believed that to read a poet in his own tongue was to hear the music of his soul, and so 3 times a week, amidst the motes of dust dancing in the afternoon sun, he taught me. We conjugated verbs, we parsed sentences, we stumbled through the dense, beautiful verses of the Divine Comedy. His face would light up as he explained a turn of phrase, the historical context of a word, the sheer genius of a rhyme scheme. "It's a beautiful language, Charlotte," he would say, his finger tracing a line in a heavy leather-bound volume, "a language of passion, of art, of history. It's a key to another world." For me, it was more than just a key. It was a fortress. Within the structures of Italian grammar, within the melody of its vocabulary, I found a space where Isabella's condescension couldn't reach me. It was something that was mine alone, a secret garden of knowledge cultivated by the person I loved most in the world. Isabella, of course, found it hilarious. She stumbled into the study one afternoon, while looking for me, her riding boots loud on the old floorboards. She found my father and me, hunched over a passage from Petrarch, our heads close together. She'd watched for a moment, a smirk playing on her lips. "What on earth are you two doing?" she'd asked, as if she'd discovered us performing some bizarre, archaic ritual. "We are reading Petrarch, Isabella," my father had replied with gentle dignity. She'd laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed in the quiet room. "Italian? Seriously? What a completely useless thing to learn. Who even speaks Italian around here? Are you planning to run away and become a gondolier, Charlotte? Honestly, Daddy's having me learn Mandarin. He says that's the language of the future, of business, dead languages," she declared with the unshakable certainty of the wealthy and ignorant, "are for dead-end people." She'd flicked her hair over her shoulder and sauntered out, leaving her words hanging in the air like a foul smell. I had felt the familiar sting of shame, my face burning, but my father had simply placed his warm, dry hand over mine. "Do not mind her, cara mia," he'd whispered, using his favorite Italian endearment for me. "The value of a thing is not determined by its price. Remember that." My father passed away from a sudden illness when I was 22. His death left a hole in my life that I thought would never be filled. The vicarage, once a place of warmth and intellectual discovery, became just a house. A new vicar moved in with his family, and my mother and I relocated to a small, rented cottage on the edge of the village, our already precarious financial situation becoming even more so. I found a job as a librarian's assistant in the nearby town, a quiet, unassuming life that suited me. I continued my studies of Italian on my own, a private tribute to my father, a way to keep his voice, his passion, alive in my heart. Isabella's life, meanwhile, continued its glittering ascent. She went to university, though she complained endlessly about the work. She traveled, sending postcards from exotic locales that felt more like boasts than greetings. She was presented at court. Her engagement to a minor aristocrat was announced in the Times. I was, of course, expected to be a bridesmaid, a role that involved a great deal of running errands and listening to her anxieties about floral arrangements and guest lists. The wedding was the social event of the decade in our corner of the world. I stood by her side in a dress she had paid for, a fact she mentioned more than once, and watched her marry a man who looked at her with the same acquisitive gleam with which he might admire a prized racehorse. My friendship with her, this strange one-sided bond of habit and history, persisted. I was a fixture, a constant. She needed someone to feel superior to, and I, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, kept playing the part. Perhaps it was a misguided sense of loyalty, or maybe it was just easier than severing a tie that had existed for as long as I could remember. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my books, I had my quiet life, and I had the beautiful, useless language my father had given me. The years rolled on. My mother's health began to fail, requiring more of my time and all of my meager savings. Isabella's marriage produced no children and ended in a quiet, expensive divorce. She returned to Blackwood Manor to live with her aging father, Lord Blackwood, settling into the role of Lady of the Manor with an air of bored entitlement. Lord Blackwood was a cold, formidable man who had always looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture in the vicarage, barely worth noticing. His health, like my mother's, was in decline, though his ailment was one of wealth and excess, a slow decay of the body brought on by too much rich food and fine brandy. When he finally died, the entire village went into a period of formal mourning. Isabella, draped in fashionable black, played the part of the grieving daughter to perfection. But in private, when I went to the manor to offer my condolences, there was a manic, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "It's all mine now, Charlotte," she'd whispered, her voice a strange mix of feigned sorrow and undisguised glee, as she gestured around the grand drawing room. "Everything. The house, the lands, the investments, all of it. I'm finally in charge." She spoke of her father's death not as a loss, but as an accession. The world, as far as she was concerned, had finally arranged itself as it was always meant to be, with her at its absolute center. The funeral was a grand affair, a testament to the Blackwood name and fortune. I sat in a pew at the back of the church, the same church my father had preached in for 30 years, and watched Isabella accept condolences with the regal air of a newly crowned queen. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a play for which I already knew the ending. I thought that this was it, the final chapter. Isabella would be the wealthy mistress of the manor, and I would be the poor librarian, and our orbits, fixed since childhood, would continue on their prescribed paths forever. I had no idea that the story was only just beginning, and that a ghost from a century past was about to walk onto the stage, speaking a language that only I could understand. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived a few weeks after the funeral, in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing an Italian postmark and the crest of a Milanese law firm. Isabella, who was still sorting through the mountain of paperwork that constituted her father's estate, treated it as a minor curiosity, probably some distant relative looking for a handout, she'd said dismissively, tossing it onto a pile of other mail when she'd shown it to me during one of my obligatory visits to the manor. She was in the library, a room I'd always loved, but which now felt oppressive under her ownership. She had redecorated, replacing the worn leather armchairs and dark wood with pale silks and gilded furniture, stripping the room of its history and warmth. But the letters kept coming. Each one was more insistent than the last. Isabella's lawyers, a prestigious London firm named Hedges and Rowe, began to look concerned. At first they were as dismissive as Isabella. They were accustomed to dealing with cranks and opportunists who emerged from the woodwork whenever a large estate was being settled. But the firm in Milan, Studio Legal Bellini, was persistent and, as Hedges and Rowe's own inquiries revealed, highly respected. The correspondence from them was entirely in Italian, a formal, dense legalese that Isabella's lawyers found utterly impenetrable. They hired a translation service in London, but the initial reports that came back were confusing and seemed to make little sense. The language was archaic, filled with obscure regional terms and complex legal phrasing from the early 20th century. The translators, accustomed to modern business contracts, were struggling. Isabella's mood soured. Her initial triumphalism gave way to a simmering, anxious rage. The inheritance, which she had viewed as her birthright, her destiny, was suddenly tangled in a web of foreign bureaucracy. "It's ridiculous," she fumed at me one afternoon, pacing back and forth on a priceless Aubusson carpet. "Some Italian nonsense from 100 years ago, my great-grandfather's time. What could it possibly have to do with me? They're just trying to extort money, that's all it is." She saw the situation not as a legal challenge, but as a personal insult. How dared anyone question her ownership of what was so obviously hers? The nature of the claim began to slowly, painstakingly emerge. It was being brought by a man named Marco Bellini, the great-grandson of Isabel's great-grandfather's younger brother. It seemed that in the early 1900s, the younger Blackwood brother, a black sheep of the family, had moved to Italy and married into an Italian family, the Bellinis. The claim was based on a series of documents from that era, a marriage contract, personal letters, and what appeared to be a business agreement between the two brothers. These were the documents that were proving so difficult to decipher. The situation escalated when Signor Bellini himself, along with his lawyer, announced they were flying to England to discuss the matter in person. A meeting was scheduled to take place at Blackwood Manor. The pressure on Hedges and Rowe mounted. They needed a definitive, accurate translation of the key documents before the meeting. Their London service was proving too slow and unreliable. The local university had a small Italian department, but the one professor qualified to handle such archaic texts was on sabbatical in Florence. Panic began to set in. Mr. Thompson, the senior partner at Hedges and Rowe, a man with a face like a clenched fist and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, was becoming increasingly agitated. His firm's reputation was on the line. I knew all of this because Isabella used me as her sounding board, her confessor. She would call me at all hours, her voice tight with panic, to vent her frustrations. "They're trying to steal my home, Charlotte. My legacy. Can you believe the nerve? And these incompetent lawyers. Daddy paid them a fortune, and they can't even read a simple letter." She was, of course, completely oblivious to the irony of her complaints. She, who had built her entire identity on the foundation of an inheritance, was now being tormented by the very history that had produced it. She lamented the complexity of it all, the unfairness. "It's all just dusty old papers in some ridiculous, dead language." She spat down the phone one night, the venom in her voice palpable. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical blow. Dead languages are for dead-end people. Her words from all those years ago in my father's study came rushing back to me. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I said nothing, of course. I just listened, murmured sympathetic noises, and let her rage. The day before the big meeting, the situation reached a crisis point. Mr. Thompson had driven up from London and was ensconced at the manor, his mood reportedly thunderous. The final translated fragments they had received from London were contradictory and raised more questions than they answered. The core of the claim remained a mystery, shrouded in the mists of a difficult dialect and turn-of-the-century legal jargon. It was in the late afternoon that my phone rang. It was Isabella. But her voice was different. The rage was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle thread of desperation. "Charlotte, can you come up to the manor? Now. Mr. Thompson wants to ask you something." I was confused. Ask me something? About what? There was a pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Then Isabella came back on the line, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. It's about your Italian." I walked up the long, winding drive to Blackwood Manor, feeling as though I were moving through a dream. The setting sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The house loomed before me, its stone facade glowing gold in the evening light. It was a place I had known my entire life, a symbol of everything I was not, everything I could never be. And yet, for the first time, I was walking towards it, not as the vicar's daughter, not as the poor friend or the charity case, but as someone they needed. The feeling was so new, so utterly foreign, that I didn't know what to make of it. I was shown into the library. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Mr. Thompson stood by the grand fireplace, his face grim. Two junior lawyers sat at the polished mahogany table, surrounded by stacks of papers and open laptops. And in the center of it all, looking small and lost in a large gilded armchair, was Isabella. Her usual air of imperious confidence had completely vanished. She looked pale and frightened. When she saw me, she didn't offer a greeting, just a weak, helpless glance. Mr. Thompson turned to me, his eyes sharp and appraising. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "Miss Halloway, Isabella tells me you have some proficiency in the Italian language." The way he said "some proficiency" was dismissive, as if inquiring about a quaint hobby like knitting or watercolor painting. I straightened my shoulders, a lifetime of being made to feel small, rising up in me. "My father taught me," I said, my voice clearer and steadier than I expected. "We studied classical and medieval Italian literature, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio." He was a scholar on the subject. Thompson's eyebrows shot up. This was clearly more than he had been expecting. "Is that so? We are in a difficult position. The documents central to this claim are written in an early 20th century legal dialect from the Lombardy region. Our usual translators are struggling with it. It is, to be blunt, a mess." He gestured to a small, carefully arranged stack of documents on the table. They were on thick, yellowed vellum, covered in an elegant, looping script that was dense and difficult to read. "We need to know what they say. We need to know what we're facing in tomorrow's meeting. Would you be willing to take a look?" It wasn't really a question. It was a command born of sheer desperation. I looked at Isabella. She was watching me, her eyes wide, a silent plea in them. This was the girl who had mocked my father, who had called his passion and my education useless, and now her entire future, the fortune that defined her, hinged on that very same useless skill. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. I felt a slow, cold anger uncoiling within me, an anger I had suppressed for decades. But alongside it, something else was stirring, a sense of power, a feeling of rightness, as if the scales of justice, so unbalanced for so long, were finally beginning to shift. I walked over to the table and sat down in the chair one of the junior lawyers vacated for me. I pulled the small stack of documents closer. The vellum was cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and dry ink filling my lungs. It smelled like my father's study. It smelled like home. "I'll take a look," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. 4 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. For the first time in my life, in this house, I was the most important person in the room. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The hush that fell over the library was heavier than any silence I had ever known. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the words I was about to speak. I picked up the topmost document. It was a formal marriage contract, dated 1908. The ink was faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was exquisite, a flowing copperplate script. I began to read, at first silently to myself. The language was indeed difficult, a labyrinth of formal salutations, archaic legal terms, and regional idioms. But as I read, my father's voice began to echo in my mind. I could hear him explaining the nuances of a subjunctive clause, the historical root of a particular word. The lessons from his dusty study, the hours spent poring over ancient texts, all came flooding back, not as memories, but as living tools. The language wasn't dead, it was sleeping, and I had the key to wake it. After a few minutes, I looked up. Mr. Thompson was watching me intently, his impatience a palpable force in the room. Isabella was chewing on her thumbnail, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer. "Well," Thompson demanded, his voice sharp. "It's a marriage contract," I began, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "Between William Blackwood, younger brother of Lord Archibald Blackwood, and Sophia Bellini of Milan." I paused, gathering my thoughts. "But it's more than that. It's also a business agreement. It seems William brought a significant asset into the marriage. Not money, but shares in the Blackwood Shipping Company." One of the junior lawyers let out a small gasp. Hedges and Rowe had assumed the shipping company, which had been sold off in the 1950s for a colossal sum, had always been wholly owned by the main family line. "Go on," Thompson commanded, his eyes narrowing. I turned to the next page. "The contract stipulates that in exchange for these shares, which were to be considered part of his wife's dowry, the Bellini family would provide William with a substantial annual income and a partnership in their textile business. It was a merger of sorts, New World industry and Old World capital." I continued reading, translating the dense paragraphs aloud. "But here is the crucial part. There's a clause, a default clause. It states that if, for any reason, the Blackwood family, specifically the head of the family, Lord Archibald Blackwood, failed to formally transfer the deeds of ownership for those shares within 1 year of the marriage, the contract would be considered in breach." Isabella made a small, choked sound. "What does that mean, in breach?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the document, on the elegant, damning script. "It means," I said slowly, "that a penalty would be enacted. The Bellini family would be entitled to compensation, not in cash, but in property. Specifically, a portion of the Blackwood agricultural holdings in the county of Sussex, equivalent in value to the shares at the time of the breach, to be held in trust for the firstborn male heir of the union between William Blackwood and Sophia Bellini." The room was utterly still. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Mr. Thompson looked as if he'd been turned to stone. "That's impossible," Isabella whispered. "My great-grandfather would never have agreed to that." I slid the marriage contract aside and picked up the next items in the stack. A bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were personal correspondence, written in a much less formal, more emotional hand. "These are letters," I said, "from William to his brother, Lord Archibald." I scanned the first one. He's pleading with him. It's dated 1909, nearly a year after the wedding. He's begging Archibald to send the share certificates. He says his new father-in-law is growing suspicious, that his honor is at stake. I picked up the next letter, dated a few months later. This one is angrier. Archibald has apparently refused. He calls the marriage a disgrace and says he will not see a piece of the Blackwood legacy handed over to foreign merchants. I could almost see it, the clash of two worlds, the proud English lord and the ambitious Italian family, the younger brother caught in the middle, and the final letter. I unfolded the last one carefully. The paper was brittle, and there were faint stains on it, as if from tears. It's from Sophia, William's wife. It's addressed to Lord Archibald. William has died. It seems he contracted pneumonia. She's heartbroken, but she's also furious. She writes, "Your pride has cost me my husband and your family its honor. We will not forget this debt. The contract stands. One day what is ours will be returned to us. My son will see to it."
"Friend!"
A heavy silence descended once more. The story was complete. A promise made, a promise broken, a debt incurred, and now, over a century later, the bill had come due. Mr. Thompson finally broke the silence. He let out a long, slow breath. "The agricultural holdings," he said, his voice flat. "That's the North Pasture, the West Grange, and the Riverlands It's nearly a third of the entire estate's land value. Isabella made a whimpering noise. No, she said, shaking her head in denial. No, she's lying. She's making it all up to get back at me. She's always been jealous. You can't believe her. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face a mask of desperation and rage. She's just the vicar's daughter. She probably learned her Italian from a restaurant menu. This is a trick. Mr. Thompson didn't even look at Isabella. His gaze was fixed on me, his expression one of grudging respect. Is there anything else? I picked up the final document. It was different from the others, a single sheet, a more modern typescript with a notarized seal at the bottom. This is a legal affidavit from the 1960s, I said. It was sworn by Marco Bellini's father. It attaches a valuation of the shipping shares from 1909 and a corresponding valuation of the specified Blackwood lands from the same year. It seems they've been keeping track of this debt for generations. It was the final nail in the coffin, a meticulous, century-long ledger of a grievance. Isabella stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. I won't allow it. This is my house, my land. I'll fight it. Her words trailed off as she looked around the room, at the grim faces of her lawyers, at the undeniable truth laid out on the table. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and utter dependence. The foundation of her world, the effortless superiority she had worn like a second skin her entire life, was crumbling to dust before her very eyes. And I, the quiet, overlooked charity case, was the one holding the hammer. The meeting the next morning was an exercise in surreal tension. It was held in the same library, which now felt less like a room of scholarly repose and more like a courtroom. On one side of the vast mahogany table sat Isabella and her legal team, led by a subdued and grim-faced Mr. Thompson. On the other side sat a handsome, silver-haired man with weary eyes, Marco Bellini, and his own lawyer, a sharp, elegant woman who spoke perfect, unaccented English. I was seated at the head of the table, between the two factions, a stack of translated summaries I had worked on late into the night, placed neatly before me. I was no longer Charlotte Halliway, the vicar's daughter. I was a neutral power, an interpreter, the sole conduit through which the truth could pass. Isabella refused to look at me. She sat ramrod straight, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She had tried to have me removed, insisting they fly in another expert from London, but Mr. Thompson had curtly informed her there was no time, and that based on his own team's frantic cross-referencing overnight, my translations appeared to be impeccable. She was trapped, forced to rely on the one person she had spent a lifetime demeaning. The meeting began. Mr. Thompson laid out the Blackwood position, a weak argument about the statute of limitations and the vagueness of the century-old contract. Then Signora Conti, Bellini's lawyer, began to speak. She laid out her client's case with calm, irrefutable logic, referencing the very clauses and letters I had translated. When a point of contention arose over a particular phrase in the marriage contract, all eyes turned to me. Miss Halliway, Signora Conti said, her tone respectful, the phrase in perpetuo, Mr. Thompson's team suggests this means for a time. How would you translate it in this context? I looked at the original document. I could feel Isabella's glare on me, a physical pressure. She was willing me to lie, to twist the meaning, to save her. I thought of my father, of his insistence on intellectual honesty. I thought of all the small, casual cruelties I had endured in this very house. In this legal context, I said, my voice clear and even, it does not mean for a time. It means in perpetuity, forever. The trust was to be held for the Bellini heirs indefinitely, until the debt was settled. A muscle twitched in Mr. Thompson's jaw. Marco Bellini nodded slowly, a flicker of satisfaction in his tired eyes. The meeting continued in this vein for over an hour. Each time a linguistic or historical question arose, I provided the answer simply and factually. I was not an advocate for either side. I was a vessel for the text. My power came not from arguing, but from simply telling the truth. With every sentence I translated, I could feel the foundation of Isabel's world cracking a little more. She was shrinking in her chair. The aura of wealth and privilege that had always surrounded her, dissipating like smoke. The climax of the meeting came when Mr. Thompson, in a last-ditch effort, tried to argue that the letters from William were merely the emotional outpourings of a dramatic young man, not legally binding expressions of intent. Signora Conti countered that they established a clear pattern of willful neglect on the part of Lord Archibald Blackwood. She turned to me. "Miss Halloway, the final letter from Sophia Bellini. What was the tone of that letter?" "Mr. Thompson characterizes it as hysterical. Would you agree?" I picked up my summary of the letter, but I didn't need it. I had memorized the words. I could feel the century-old pain of the woman who wrote them. "Hysterical is not the word I would use," I said, looking directly at Mr. Thompson, but speaking to the whole room. "The tone is one of profound grief, but also of cold, resolute anger. Her words are precise. She doesn't make threats. She states facts. She writes, 'Il vostro orgoglio ha spezzato il mio cuore, ma non la mia volontà.' Your pride has broken my heart, but not my will." She speaks of the contract not as a grievance, but as an enduring legal and moral obligation. The letter is not hysterical. It is powerful. As I spoke the Italian phrase, a sound escaped Isabella's lips, a half sob, half gasp. It was the sound of utter defeat. She finally looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the collapse of her entire world. The superiority, the condescension, the casual cruelty, it was all gone, replaced by a raw, naked pleading. She was, for the first time in her life, helpless, and I was the one who had rendered her so, not through malice, but by honoring the one gift she had always mocked. The silence that followed my words was the sound of a dynasty being broken. The case was over. There would be no court battle. There would only be a settlement. The ghost of Sophia Bellini, after a century of waiting, had finally had her say. In the stunned aftermath of the meeting, the library emptied out, leaving only Isabella and me. The lawyers had retreated to another room to begin the grim arithmetic of the settlement. Marco Bellini had given me a deep, formal bow and a quiet "Grazie, Signorina," his gratitude and respect a stark contrast to the decades of disrespect I'd received from the room's owner. Now we were alone, surrounded by the silent, judging books. The air was thick with the ghosts of unspoken words, of 1,000 slights, and a lifetime of inequality. Isabella just sat there for a long moment, staring at the polished surface of the table, as if it held the answers to a question she didn't know how to ask. Her perfect composure had shattered, leaving behind a fragile, broken thing I barely recognized. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why did you do it, Charlotte? You could have helped me. You could have said the words meant something else, anything else." The question was so quintessentially Isabella. It never occurred to her that I was simply telling the truth. In her world, words were tools, things to be manipulated to get what you wanted. The idea of objective truth was as foreign to her as poverty. "I didn't do anything, Isabella," I said, and I was surprised by the calm in my own voice. The anger I had felt earlier had subsided, replaced by a vast, quiet clarity. I read what was written. "That's all. After everything my family has done for you," she said, her voice rising, grasping for the old, familiar weapon of guilt. "The clothes, the parties, we always included you. We treated you like family." A short, bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Like family? Isabella, you treated me like a pet, something to be patronized and occasionally shown off to prove your own generosity. You never saw me as an equal. You never saw me at all. You saw the poor vicar's daughter, the charity case, a convenient drab backdrop for your own brilliance. She flinched as if I had struck her. That's not true, isn't it? I pressed on, the words flowing now, a torrent held back for too long. What about my 8th birthday, when you told me books were for people who couldn't afford real adventures? Or the garden party, when you humiliated me in front of your friends over my dress? Or the day you walked into my father's study and called his passion, my passion, a useless hobby for dead-end people? Do you have any idea how much that hurt? Tears were welling in her eyes now, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. I was just a child. We were children. We were, I agreed, but the pattern never changed. You just got better at it, more subtle. You've spent our entire lives reminding me of my place. Well, today, for the first time, we both found out what our places really are. Yours is to answer for your family's history, and mine is to read it. She had no answer to that. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. The power dynamic, the bedrock of our entire relationship, had not just shifted, it had been pulverized. I stood up. The interview was over. The lawyers will sort out the details, I said, my voice gentle now. There was no need for any more anger. It was like kicking a fallen statue. You're not going to be destitute, Isabel. You'll still be a very wealthy woman. You just won't own everything. I turned and walked toward the library door. As my hand touched the cool brass knob, she spoke one last time, her voice small and broken. What will you do now? I paused, my back still to her. I thought about the future, a future that just yesterday had seemed a narrow, unchanging path. Now, it was a wide, open road. The world my father had promised me, the one accessible through books and language, suddenly felt real, tangible. Marco Bellini had already hinted at needing someone in England to help manage the new properties, someone he could trust, someone who understood both the language and the history. I don't know, I said truthfully, but for the first time in my life, it feels like I get to choose. I walked out of the library, closing the door softly behind me. I walked down the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. I didn't look back. I walked out the massive front doors and into the clean, fresh air, leaving the shadows and ghosts of Blackwood Manor behind me. The long walk back to my small cottage felt different this time. The weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 30 years. The weight of her condescension, of my own perceived inadequacy, had been lifted. I felt light. I felt free. I tilted my face up to the sky, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally walking into my own story. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet, seismic shifts. The settlement was reached quickly and discreetly. Isabella, on the advice of a shell-shocked Mr. Thompson, ceded the lands stipulated in the contract to a new trust managed by Marco Bellini. It was a massive financial blow, forcing her to sell off a collection of art and other assets to cover the associated taxes and legal fees. The news rippled through the county, whispered in drawing rooms, and over tea. The invincible fortress of the Blackwood fortune had been breached. Isabella retreated into the manor, a wounded queen in a shrinking kingdom, and was rarely seen. True to his word, Marco Bellini offered me a job. It was more than a job. It was a career. He needed a liaison in England, someone to oversee the management of the newly acquired lands, which he intended to farm using modern sustainable methods. He also needed assistance with his family's textile business, which was looking to expand into the British market. The work required fluency in Italian, a deep understanding of English land law, and a delicate touch for negotiation. He offered me a salary that was more than I had earned in 5 years at the library, along with a generous budget to set up a small office and continue my education. I accepted without a moment's hesitation. I enrolled in an online course in contract law, my evenings, once spent in quiet solitude, now filled with study and purpose. I moved out of the cramped cottage my mother and I had shared and bought a small, charming house on the other side of the village, one with a garden and a room I turned into my own study, lining the walls with my father's books. It was the first property a Holloway had ever owned in this village. My mother, whose health had stabilized, came to live with me, her delight in our new home a constant source of joy. The cycle of dependence had been broken. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after the settlement, I was walking through the village square when I saw her. Isabel was coming out of the small local shop, a basket over her arm. She looked different, thinner. The designer clothes were still there, but they seemed to hang on her differently, without the old armor of arrogance. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wore little makeup. For the first time, she just looked like a woman, not an heiress. Our eyes met across the square. A flicker of the old panic crossed her face, followed by something else I couldn't quite read. I expected her to turn away, to stride to her car and pretend she hadn't seen me, but she didn't. She stood there, holding her basket, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting between friends. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a concession. It was the silent admission of a new reality. I nodded back, just as briefly, and continued on my way. There was nothing left to say. Our story had been written, translated, and concluded. I've learned a lot in the past year. I learned that a person's worth has nothing to do with the house they live in or the money they have. I learned that the things people dismiss as useless can often be the most valuable assets you possess. My father gave me a key to a language, and I thought it was just a key to unlock the beauty of old poetry. I never realized it was also the key to my own future, the key to my freedom. The greatest inheritance I received wasn't one of land or money, but of knowledge, passed down with love in a dusty room full of books. That is a fortune that can never be contested, a legacy that no one can ever take away. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. It's been a long and winding journey, and sharing it with all of you means more than you know. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a skill or a passion that someone else dismissed, only for it to become incredibly important later in your life? Share your story below. I truly believe we can all learn and draw strength from each other's experiences. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your own power in the most unexpected places. Remember, your value is not determined by anyone else's opinion. It is something you cultivate yourself, a quiet garden that can, when the time is right, bloom in the most spectacular way. Thank you for being here with me. I wish you all the strength and clarity you deserve on your own journeys.